As I approached my property, I saw my husband and mother-in-law showing my premarital house to a buyer. They thought I was completely stupid, but they didn't know I could throw a punch if needed. I stood at the stove, stirring the borscht, listening to the leaves rustling outside the window. Fall in our small town was always so golden and quiet, with the smell of damp earth. The house where Andrew and I lived had been mine since childhood. My parents left it to me when they moved to the countryside to live with my aunt in their final years. This house wasn't just walls, it was a whole history. There were creaky floorboards that Dad fixed every summer, Mom's daisy-patterned curtains that still hung in the living room, and the attic where I used to hide with my books as a child. Everything here breathed memories, and I loved this place the way you love an old friend. Andrew, my husband, was different. He didn't see anything special about the house, just a roof over our heads, which, in his words, could be better. We got married 3 years ago, and at first everything went smoothly. He worked as an electrician at the factory, and I kept books at the local clinic. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. We had enough to live on. Andrew was charming, with a warm smile and a habit of joking in any situation. When he first came to our yard to fix the wiring, I never thought that a year later I'd become his wife. He knew how to win people over. He'd pick a flower from the neighbor's flower bed or tell a joke so well that I'd laugh until I cried. But there was one trait in him that sometimes worried me. Andrew looked to his mother, Linda Patterson, too often. She lived in the next neighborhood in a neat 2-bedroom apartment and called her son almost every day. She'd ask him to take her to the market or complain that her faucet was leaking. Andrew would rush to her like there was a fire, even if we'd already made plans. I didn't object. After all, she's his mother, and how could I refuse to help? Linda seemed like a pleasant woman, always with a smile and a bag of pastries that she'd bring when she visited. "You young people live happily, and I'll always support you," she'd say, adjusting her neatly styled hair. I believed that's how it would be. That evening, when the borscht was almost done, Andrew came home later than usual. I heard the front door slam and his boots shuffling down the hallway. He walked into the kitchen, threw his bag on the chair, and without looking at me said, "Mom needs money again. Her electric bill came, and her pension isn't for another week." I nodded without looking up from the pot. This wasn't Linda's first request, and I was already used to Andrew sometimes forwarding part of his paycheck to her. "How much?" I asked, thinking I might have to postpone buying a new washing machine. "8,000, no more," he muttered and went into the room to turn on the TV. I turned off the stove and sat at the table, looking at a plate with cold tea. 3,000 wasn't a fortune, but something in Andrew's tone bothered me. He spoke as if it was self-evident, as if my money was his money and his mother's too. I shook my head, pushing the thought away. "Don't make things up, Natalie," I told myself. "We're family, and that's how it should be in a family, helping each other." But somewhere in my chest it still stung, like a needle was stuck there. The next day I went to see my friend Vera, who lived downtown. Vera was my outlet. With her, I could talk about everything from pickling recipes to neighborhood gossip. She worked at a hair salon and always knew who fought with whom and who bought what. We sat in her kitchen drinking coffee, and I don't know why, but I told her about Andrew and his mother. Vera snorted, setting down her cup. "Natalie, why are you so kind? Today it's 3,000, tomorrow it's 5, and then she'll want to sell your house to buy herself a cottage." I laughed, but the laugh came out nervous. "Come on, Vera, what house?" "It's mine, from before the wedding." Vera squinted. "You watch out, girlfriend. Men who cling to their mama's skirts never lead to anything good." I walked home, and Vera's words spun in my head. The house was registered in my name, and Andrew had never hinted that he wanted to sell or rent it. But still, something in her words stuck like a splinter. When I entered the yard, Andrew was rummaging in the shed, fixing something. He looked up and smiled. "Why so thoughtful?" I shrugged and went into the house without answering. That evening at dinner, he suddenly said, Mom said she liked your attic. She says you could make a room there if you insulate it. I froze with my spoon in hand. A room? What for? I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. Andrew shrugged. Well, you never know, for guests or something. I nodded, but inside everything clenched. This was my house, my attic, my memories. I didn't want anyone, even his mother, deciding what to do with them. A month passed after that conversation about the attic, and I tried not to obsess. Life rolled on as usual. Work, home, evenings with Andrew watching shows. But something changed, not immediately, not obviously, but as if a faint smell of smoke appeared in the air, though it was unclear where it was coming from. Andrew started mentioning Linda more often. She'd call and ask him to pick up groceries or complain that her back hurt, and he'd rush to her with ointments. I didn't object, but every time he came back late with a tired face, I felt irritation growing inside. Not at him, but at the fact that his mother seemed to consider him her personal assistant. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of the door opening. Andrew had already left. A note lay on the table. Went to Mom's. Need to hang a shelf. Back by noon. I sighed, made myself coffee, and sat by the window looking at our yard. The yard was small but cozy. An old maple tree that Dad planted when I was born, beds with dill and parsley that I planted last summer, and a wooden bench where Andrew and I sometimes drank tea in the evenings. This house was my refuge, and I couldn't imagine ever losing it. But Vera's words about Linda possibly wanting to sell the house still spun in my head like a persistent fly. Andrew didn't return by noon. I called him, but he dropped the call and then sent a message. Running late, Mom asked me to sort through the garage too. I threw the phone on the couch and went to peel potatoes to distract myself. The potatoes flew into the bowl with some fury, as if I was arguing with them. This is normal, I kept telling myself. He's helping his mother. What's wrong with that? But in my chest it still ached, like an old wound that someone accidentally touched. When Andrew finally returned, it was already dark. He looked exhausted, but smiled as always, as if nothing had happened. Mom had to sort through everything in the garage. Can you imagine? There's junk from 100 years there, he said, kicking off his boots. I nodded without looking at him and put a plate with dinner on the table. He sat down, started eating, and then suddenly added, By the way, she was talking about your house again. Said it's too big for 2 people. Maybe rent out some rooms? Extra money wouldn't hurt. I froze, holding a fork. Rent to whom? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Andrew shrugged. Well, to students, for example, or visitors. Mom says it's trendy now. I slowly put the fork on the table. This is my house, Andrew. I don't want strangers in it. He looked at me as if surprised, then nodded. Okay, I was just saying. Mom suggested it, so I passed it along. I said nothing, but inside everything was boiling. Linda suggested, and Andrew, instead of telling her it was none of her business, just passed it along. I went to wash dishes, so I wouldn't lose it. Water poured over the plates, and I thought, why is she meddling in our house at all? She has her own apartment, pension, a son who already runs to her at the first call. What does she want from us? From me? The next day, I decided to talk to my neighbor, Aunt Clara. She lived across the fence and knew everyone in the area. Aunt Clara was as straightforward as a rail and always said what she thought. I dropped by with a jar of jam, just as an excuse, and over tea told her about Linda and her ideas about the house. Aunt Clara frowned, sipped her tea, and said, Natalie, you watch out. Mothers-in-law, they're like that. First they give advice, then they start commanding. I had fun with mine, God rest her soul. She used to decide where I should plant flowers, and I endured it. Don't be a fool, don't endure. It's your house, you're the boss. I nodded, but my head was foggy. Don't endure, but how? Tell Linda off. Tell Andrew to stop listening to her? But what if he gets offended? A couple days later, Linda showed up herself, bringing a cabbage pie and starting to tell how hard it was for her alone. I have no strength, Natalie dear, doing everything myself. The pension is small and prices keep rising. Good thing Andrew helps. I smiled, nodded, but inside everything was clenching. She spoke as if I owed her something. And then, as if in passing, she added, "If only you had more spare money, I could maybe do some repairs in the apartment. The wallpaper is already peeling." I looked at Andrew, but he was buried in his phone, as if he hadn't heard. "We'll think about it," I said to end the conversation. Linda smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. That evening, after she left, I asked Andrew, "Do you really want to rent out rooms? Or is this just her idea?" He sighed as if I was annoying him. "Natalie, why are you starting? Nobody's renting anything. Mom just thinks about how we can all do better. Us or her." I couldn't help myself. Andrew frowned. "Why are you so against her? She's not a stranger." I wanted to answer, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I went to the bedroom and lay down, staring at the ceiling. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking that my house, my comfort, my life, all of it seemed to no longer be just mine. At work, I told my colleague Lib about this. She was older than me, with 2 grown children, and always gave good advice. Luba listened, shook her head, and said, "Natalie, don't let them relax. Your mother-in-law may not be evil, but such women love to bend everything to their will. And your husband, he's like putty. Whatever Mom says, that's what he molds. Either you set boundaries, or they'll trample you." I nodded, but my soul was uneasy. Boundaries, it sounds simple, but how do you set them when you love someone? When you want everything to be good? That same evening, Andrew came home from work and said that Linda was inviting us to dinner at her place on the weekend. "She wants to gather the family," chat, he explained. I agreed, though I didn't want to go. Something told me this dinner wouldn't just be a family gathering. And I wasn't wrong. The evening at Linda started as I expected, with her signature smile and the smell of meatballs coming from the kitchen. Her apartment was clean, but somehow cramped, despite having 2 rooms. Everything in it screamed of the past: an old sideboard with crystal glasses, a faded carpet on the wall, photos of Andrew in his school uniform neatly arranged on the shelf. Linda bustled about, putting salads on the table, pouring compote, and kept saying, "You young people, eat. Don't be shy. I worked hard for you." Andrew smiled like a child who'd been given candy, and I suddenly caught myself thinking that here, in this apartment, he looked different. Not my husband, but her son, obedient and somehow too soft. We sat at the table, chatting about trivialities, the weather, how expensive tomatoes had gotten, the upstairs neighbor who flooded Linda's bathroom. I tried to be polite, nodding along, but inside I kept waiting for the catch. And it didn't take long. When the meatballs were eaten and the compote drunk, Linda leaned back in her chair and said, "Natalie, dear, I've been thinking. Your house is big, right? And there's only 2 of you. Maybe it's worth optimizing it a bit." I froze, feeling blood rush to my temples. Optimizing. I repeated, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. She nodded as if it was self-evident. "Well, yes, for example, sell it and buy something smaller downtown and use the difference in money for something useful. I could use some repairs, and you young people could use extra money too." I looked at Andrew, expecting him to say this was nonsense, that our house was our house and nobody was selling it. But he was silent, picking at the remains of salad with his fork. "Andrew, what do you think?" I asked, no longer hiding my tension. He looked up, shrugged, and muttered, "Well, Mom just suggested an idea. We can discuss it." Discuss. That word hit me like a slap. My house, which I love, which I inherited from my parents, which I cleaned, repaired, decorated, it turns out can be discussed. I clenched my fists under the table to keep from losing it, and said as calmly as possible, "Linda, the house is not for sale. It's mine from before the wedding, and I don't want to change anything." She looked at me with such a smile, as if I were a child who doesn't understand what they're being told. "Natalie, dear, don't think badly. I'm just trying to help you. It's just that the house is so big and you're alone together. It's just not rational. I stood up from the table, mumbling something about dishes, and went to the kitchen. There, standing at the sink, I breathed deeply to keep from crying with anger. Did Andrew really think this was normal, that his mother could just casually decide what to do with my house? When we got home, I couldn't hold back. Are you seriously thinking that selling the house is a good idea? I asked as soon as we crossed the threshold. Andrew sighed, as if I'd started an old record again. Natalie, why do you immediately boil over? Mom just thinks about how we can do better. She's not forcing anything. Don't you think she thinks too much for us? I shot back. He frowned. Why are you so against her? She's alone. It's hard for her, and you immediately take offense. I wanted to answer, but the word stuck. Instead, I went to the bedroom and slammed the door. The next day, I went to work with a heavy heart. At the clinic, it was, as usual, patients lined stacks of papers. Luba, noticing my face, dragged me to the break room for tea. I told her about the dinner, about the optimization, and about how Andrew stayed silent. Luba shook her head. Natalie, I told you boundaries. If you don't set them, they'll keep pushing further. Your mother-in-law clearly isn't the type who just bakes pies. And your husband, he runs after her like a puppy. Either you have a heart-to-heart with him, or wait until they sell your whole house right under your nose. I nodded, but inside I felt empty. Heart to heart. But what if he says again that I'm the one being difficult? That evening Andrew acted as if nothing had happened. He brought me chocolate, turned on a comedy, even tried to hug me. But I pulled away. Why are you so cold? He asked, and there was irritation in his voice. I'm not cold. I just don't understand why your mother is deciding what to do with my house, I answered. He rolled his eyes. There you go again. Nobody's deciding anything. It was just a conversation. But I no longer believed in just a conversation. Something told me Linda wouldn't back down. A week later, I accidentally overheard Andrew talking on the phone. He was in the yard, thought I couldn't hear, but the kitchen window was open. Mom, I'll talk to her, but she's stubborn, you know, he said, then added, Yes, the house is big, but it's hers. I can't just take it. I didn't listen to the rest because blood was pounding in my ears. He was discussing my house with her behind my back. I went out to the yard, trying to control myself, and asked, What are you chatting about with Mom? Andrew flinched like a caught schoolboy and mumbled, Nothing, just talking. But I saw how he looked away. That evening, for the first time, I thought that maybe Vera and Luba were right. Maybe I'd been tolerating too long. But I still loved Andrew, his smile, his jokes, his warm hands when he hugged me before bed. I decided I'd try one more time. Talk, explain, find the words. I didn't want to fight, didn't want to destroy our family. But deep down, I already knew that this conversation wouldn't change anything. The next day, Linda called me herself. Natalie, dear, I was thinking, she began in her sweet voice. I have an acquaintance who's a realtor. A good person, reliable. Maybe he could look at your house. Tell you how much it's worth? Just so you know. I gripped the phone so hard my fingers turned white. Linda, I told you the house is not for sale, I answered, trying not to lose it. She laughed as if I'd made a joke. Oh, Natalie, why do you immediately take offense? I'm trying to help you. I hung up without listening to the rest. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just an idea. This was a plan. And Andrew, it seemed, was in it up to his ears. After that call from Linda, I felt as if a strange shadow had settled in my house. Everything looked the same curtains with daisies, the same maple outside the window, the same creaking floorboards underfoot. But now every corner, everything reminded me that someone, not me, was making plans for what was mine. I walked through the rooms, touching the old dresser that Mom bought before I was born, stroking the peeling paint on the windowsill, and inside something heavy grew like a stone. This was my house, my fortress, and I wasn't going to give it to anyone. But how to tell Andrew so he'd understand, so he wouldn't just nod as always but actually hear me? Andrew acted as if nothing had changed. In the morning, he drank coffee, joked about the weather, in the evening watched football, and called me to sit next to him. But I noticed little things that had escaped me before. He started checking his phone more often, quickly hiding it when I approached. Sometimes when I entered a room, he'd suddenly fall silent, as if afraid I'd hear something unnecessary. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, that I was overthinking because of Vera and Luba's words. But the splinter in my soul grew, and I could no longer ignore it. One day, midweek, I came home from work earlier than usual. The power went out at the clinic, and they sent us home. I entered the yard, expecting to see Andrew in the shed. He loved tinkering with tools there, but his car wasn't there. The house was empty too. I threw my bag on the couch and decided to make tea, but then noticed a piece of paper on the kitchen table. It was a utility bill, but not ours, Linda's. I frowned, picked up the paper. The bill was for her apartment with a note, paid, and yesterday's date. So Andrew had been transferring money to her again. I wasn't against helping, but why didn't he tell me? Why was I finding out about this by accident, rummaging through papers? I sat at the table looking at this bill and suddenly remembered how a couple days ago Andrew had asked me for $1,000 for spare parts. Said he needed to buy something for work, but now I had doubts. Was he lying? Was he taking my money to cover his mom's bills? I put the paper aside, deciding I'd ask him that evening, but inside everything was boiling. This wasn't about $1,000. It was about trust. If he was hiding such little things, what else could he be hiding? When Andrew returned, I couldn't keep it all in anymore. He came in as usual with a smile, threw his keys on the shelf, and said, "So, Natalie, what's for dinner?" I silently handed him the bill. He looked at the paper, then at me, and the smile slowly slid off his face. "Is this an interrogation?" he asked, and there was irritation in his voice. "No, not an interrogation," I answered, trying to speak calmly. "Just explain why I'm finding your mother's bills at our house, and why you're taking money from me without saying what it's for." Andrew snorted, as if I'd said something funny. "Are you serious? It's Mom's bill. I helped. So what? We're family, Natalie. Or are you going to count every penny now?" I clenched my fists, feeling blood pound in my temples. "It's not about pennies, Andrew. It's about you lying. You said you needed money for spare parts, not for your mom's bills." He rolled his eyes, as if I were a child nitpicking over trifles. "So what? I didn't want to burden you. Mom asked, I helped. Why are you making a big deal?" I stood up to keep from losing it. "I'm not making a big deal. I just want you to be honest, and for your mother to stop meddling in our life." Andrew frowned. "There you go again. She's not meddling, she's helping. And you're always unhappy." This conversation led nowhere. Andrew went to another room, slamming the door, and I stayed in the kitchen, looking at the cold tea. I felt like a stranger in my own house. And the scariest part, I was starting to doubt Andrew, whether he loved me the way I loved him, whether he even saw me, or if I was just an appendage to the house, to the money, to his life. The next day, I went to Aunt Clara. I needed to talk, and she always knew how to listen. We sat in her yard on that same bench where she loved drinking tea with neighbors. I told her about the bill, about the conversation, about how Linda kept talking more and more about my house. Aunt Clara listened, shook her head, and said, "Natalie, I'll tell you this. Your mother-in-law is no fool. She knows her son will follow her like a calf after a cow. If she's planning something with your house, she won't stop. And your husband, he's weak. Not mean, but weak. Either you take everything into your own hands, or they'll crush you." I nodded, but my head was empty. Take into my own hands, but how? Fight with Andrew, kick him out? What if I'm not ready? What if I still hope he'll understand? A couple days later, I noticed something else strange. An unfamiliar car appeared in our yard, a black sedan I'd never seen before. It stood not far from the gate, and I thought maybe one of the neighbors bought a new one. But the next day the car was there again, and I saw a man in a suit get out with a folder in his hands. He stood, looked at our house, wrote something down, and left. I didn't pay much attention, but my soul felt anxious. That evening I asked Andrew if he knew what that car was, but he shrugged. Maybe someone got lost. I nodded, but didn't believe him. At work I told Lubo about this. She frowned. Natalie, this isn't just nothing. Sounds like a realtor. Check. Maybe they're already up to something with your house. I laughed, but the laugh came out nervous. Come on, Luba, don't make things up. And Drew would tell me, but deep down I wasn't sure anymore. That evening I decided to check his phone. I'd never done this before, and I was ashamed but curiosity won. Andrew was in the shower, and his phone was on the table. I opened the messages and found his correspondence with Linda. Talk to her, son, she wrote. The house is worth a lot, and we need money. I already found someone, he'll take a look. Andrew replied, Mom, she won't agree. You know how attached she is to the house. Linda wrote, Then convince her you're the man. I put the phone down, feeling the floor disappear from under my feet. They were discussing my house without me, planning how to sell it, as if I didn't exist. I sat in the kitchen until Andrew came out of the bathroom, and when he entered, I said, We need to talk tomorrow. Seriously. He looked at me as if he wanted to ask something, but I went to the bedroom and closed the door. That night, I didn't sleep, staring into the darkness and thinking how far everything had gone. And how could I now live with someone who was betraying me behind my back? The morning after I found the messages was gray, as if the sky knew what was in my soul. I got up before Andrew, made coffee but didn't drink it, just sat at the table looking at the cup until it went cold. Fragments of their messages spun in my head. The house is worth a lot. Convince her we need money. Each word was like a knife, and I couldn't understand how Andrew, my Andrew, who swore to love me, could do this to me. I waited for him to wake up so we could talk, but inside everything trembled with anger, hurt, fear that this conversation would destroy everything we had. Andrew came into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, and as if nothing had happened, said, Good morning, Natalie, why so gloomy? I looked at him, and I suddenly felt disgusted by his smile, by this habit of his to pretend everything was fine. Sit down, I said, and my voice was colder than I expected. We need to talk. He frowned, but sat, putting his hands on the table. I took his phone, which was still on the windowsill, and put it in front of him. Explain this, I said, opening the correspondence with Linda. Andrew went pale, as if he'd been caught red-handed, and mumbled, You went through my phone. I expected him to make excuses, but this question made me furious. Yes, I did, I answered without looking away. And you know what I found? That you and your mom are planning to sell my house. My house, Andrew, without my knowledge. He opened his mouth to say something, but I didn't let him interrupt. I saw everything. You discussed with her how to convince me, as if I'm a fool who doesn't understand anything. Andrew leaned back in his chair, rubbed his face with his hands, and sighed. Natalie, you understood it all wrong. Nobody's going to sell anything. Mom, she thinks about how we can do better. She suggested looking at how much the house is worth, so maybe we could decide something later. I clenched my fists to keep from screaming. Later? And why am I finding out about this last? Why are you discussing this with her and not with me? He was silent, looking at the table, and this silence was worse than any words. I suddenly realized he wasn't arguing not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd already decided everything for himself. Andrew, I said, and my voice trembled. This is my house. Mine, not yours, not your mother's. I won't let anyone decide what to do with it. He looked up, and in his eyes was a mixture of irritation and fatigue. Natalie, you're acting like we're enemies. Mom just wants to help. It's hard for her. She has debts, and we're sitting here in a big house as if we need all this. I froze. As if we need this. I repeated, Are you serious? This is my house, Andrew. My memory, my life. And you're saying we don't need it. The conversation hit a dead end. Andrew started raising his voice, accusing me of being selfish, of not wanting to help his mother, of thinking only about myself. I tried to explain that it wasn't about money, but about him betraying me, but he wasn't listening. Finally, he stood up, grabbed his jacket, and said, "I'm going to Mom's. Need to clear my head." The door slammed, and I was left alone in the silence that pressed on my ears. I sat in the kitchen, looking at his unfinished coffee, and felt something inside me breaking. Not love. I still loved him, fool that I was, but faith. Faith that we were together, that we were a team. I spent the whole day in a fog. I walked around the house, touching things, remembering how Dad and I painted the walls, how Mom taught me to bake pies in this very kitchen. This house wasn't just a roof over my head. It was part of me. And the thought that Andrew and his mother wanted to take it away was unbearable. I called Vera, but she was busy at the salon, and I just left her a message. "Everything's bad. Let's talk later." Luba at work couldn't talk either. She had patience. I was alone with my thoughts, and that was the worst. By evening, Andrew returned. He looked calmer, but there was something new in his eyes. Stubbornness I hadn't noticed before. "I talked to Mom," he said, sitting on the couch. "She says you're overreacting. Nobody wants to hurt you. We're just thinking about how everyone can do better." I looked at him like a stranger. "Everyone." I repeated, "Did anyone ask me what's better for me?" He sighed. "Natalie, you won't even let us talk. Mom found someone who can evaluate the house. Just evaluate without any sales. What's scary about that?" I felt blood pounding in my temples. "What's scary is that you're making deals with her behind my back. What's scary is you don't see how she's manipulating you. And what's scary is that you're not on my side." We fought again. Andrew yelled that I was ungrateful, that his mother had worked her whole life for him and I hated her. I yelled that I didn't hate her, but what he was letting her do to our life. At some point I said, "If your mom is so important to you, maybe you should move in with her." He froze, looked at me as if I'd hit him, and said, "Maybe I will." And he left, not to his mom's, just out of the house into the night, leaving me in emptiness. I didn't sleep until morning, thinking about what to do. Divorce. The word was scary, but it no longer seemed impossible. I loved Andrew, but I couldn't live with someone who didn't respect me, my house, my boundaries. In the morning, I decided I'd give him one more chance. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted to be sure I'd done everything I could. I texted him, "Come over, let's talk. But if you're going to defend your mom again, I don't know what's next." He replied, "Okay, this evening." I waited, hoping he'd choose me, but deep down I already knew he wouldn't. During the day, I went to the market to buy groceries and distract myself. There, among the noise and crowds, I accidentally ran into Aunt Clara. She was carrying a bag of potatoes and, seeing me, immediately asked, "Natalie, what's wrong? You look like a ghost. Your mother-in-law again." I told her about the messages, about the fight, about the car in the yard. Aunt Clara frowned. "Listen, dear, I saw some man in a suit with a folder come to your place. I thought it was about the meters, but now I'm not sure. Check. Maybe they already brought a realtor." I felt a chill run down my spine. A realtor? So this wasn't just talk. They were taking action. That evening Andrew came, but the conversation ended in nothing again. He promised he'd talk to his mom, that she wouldn't meddle anymore. But I could see he didn't believe it himself. I said, "Andrew, if I see one more time that you and her scheming behind my back, I don't know how we'll continue." He nodded, but in his eyes was something I didn't like, not remorse, but resentment. And I understood that this was only the beginning. A week passed after our last conversation, and I tried to live as before, but it was like trying to dance on broken glass. Every morning, I woke with the thought that something would happen today, that Andrew was hiding something again, that Linda hadn't backed down. I checked the yard like a paranoid, looking to see if that black car had appeared again. I even started locking the gate, though we'd never done that before. Our town was quiet, and everyone knew each other. But now I felt like I was under siege, and my enemy wasn't just my mother-in-law, but my own husband. Andrew. as if sensing my tension, became quieter than water, lower than grass. He didn't mention his mom anymore, didn't start conversations about the house, even tried to be more affectionate. He'd hug me, ask how my day was, but I could see it wasn't from the heart, but from fear that I'd lose it again. His smile was strained, and his eyes darted like someone who knows they're guilty but doesn't want to admit it. I tried to believe he'd keep his word, that he'd talk to Linda and put an end to her ideas, but deep down I knew it was self-deception. He wouldn't choose me if he had to choose between me and her. On Friday, I decided to tidy up the house to distract myself. I pulled out the vacuum, wiped dust, sorted through old things in the storage room. There, among boxes with Mom's albums and Dad's tools, I found an old notebook where Mom wrote down recipes. I sat on the floor, leafing through yellowed pages, and suddenly came across her handwriting. Natalie for the future home. It was a recipe for a pie we baked together when I was 10. I sat holding this notebook, and tears rolled down my cheeks by themselves. Not because I was weak, but because this house, these things, these memories, they were my roots. And the thought that someone wanted to tear them out was unbearable. That evening I decided to talk to Andrew one more time, but not about fights, about us. I wanted to understand if we had a future, or if I was just holding on to a ghost of what was. When he came home from work, I put the kettle on and said, "Andrew, let's be honest. What do you want? For us to live like before, or for your mom to decide for us?" He looked at me as if I'd asked a question with no answer, and said, "Natalie, I want everything to be good, for you not to be angry, for Mom not to worry. I'm between you two, like between two fires." I shook my head. "You're not between, Andrew. You're with her. You listen to her, defend her, not me." He frowned. "You're being unfair. I said I'd talk to her. She won't talk about the house anymore." I wanted to believe, but Aunt Clara's words about the realtor spun in my head. "Okay," I said, "but if I see you two scheming again, I won't stay silent." He nodded, but there was no confidence in his nod. The next day I went to Vera. I needed to vent, and she always knew how to listen without interrupting. We sat in her small kitchen, drank mint tea, and I told her everything. About the messages, the fights, the car in the yard, about how Andrew swears he'll fix everything, but I don't believe him. Vera listened, put down her cup, and said, "Natalie, I'll be straight with you. You love him, but he doesn't respect you. And without respect, there's no love. If he's making deals with his mom behind your back now, what comes next? He's a weakling. Sorry for being harsh. And your mother-in-law, she's like a spider weaving her web, and he's caught in it." I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. "So what do I do?" I asked. "Divorce? I don't want to destroy everything." Vera shrugged. "I don't know, girlfriend. But if you stay and he doesn't change, you'll lose yourself. And your house, it's like a symbol. If you give it up, you give up yourself." I drove home with a heavy heart. Vera's words were true, but this truth cut like a knife. I loved Andrew, but I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was normal. When I entered the yard, I noticed the gate was ajar, though I'd definitely closed it. I went into the house, but Andrew wasn't there. A note lay on the table. "Went to a friend's, will be late." I felt a chill run down my spine. What friend? Why didn't he say? I went out to the yard to check the shed, and suddenly heard voices behind the fence. It was Andrew and Linda. They stood by the neighbor's house, and I heard her say, "Son, I made arrangements with Victor. He'll come tomorrow to look at the property. Just take Natalie somewhere so she doesn't see." Andrew replied, "Mom, I don't know how to do that. She's already on edge." Linda snorted. "Well, think of something. She's not a child, she'll manage." I froze, feeling blood pound in my ears. They weren't just talking, they were planning. Planning to bring a realtor, show my house, my property, while I was somewhere managing. I wanted to run out, scream, but my legs seemed rooted to the ground. Instead, I quietly went back into the house, closed the door, and sat on the couch. Everything inside was burning, but I forced myself to breathe. They think I'm stupid, think I won't notice anything. But they're wrong. That evening Andrew returned as if nothing had happened. He was more cheerful than usual, even suggested going to a cafe on the weekend. "We haven't gone out in a while, Natalie," he said, and his smile was so warm I almost believed it. Almost. But I knew this wasn't about us. It was about their plan. He wanted to get me out of the house so Linda could bring her Victor. I nodded, smiled, and said, "Okay, let's go." And to myself I thought, "I'll outsmart you." That night I didn't sleep, thinking about what to do. I could make a scene, but that wouldn't solve anything. Andrew would deny everything again, and Linda would pretend I was hysterical. I could leave, pretend I didn't know anything, but then they'd definitely bring the realtor. And I decided to wait. Wait and watch how far they'd go. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing I knew for sure, I wouldn't give up my house. Not to Andrew, not to his mother, not to their Victor. And if I had to, I'd fight for it, if not with fists, then with words. But deep down I felt that this fight would destroy not only their plans, but my family too. Saturday morning was clear, with that autumn light when everything seems cleaner and brighter. But inside I was dark as before a storm. I woke early before Andrew stirred, and lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about what to do. Their plan, which I'd overheard, spun in my head like a broken record. Take Natalie away. Victor will come look at the property. I knew today would decide everything. They thought I wouldn't notice anything, that I'd go to the cafe with Andrew, smiling like a fool, while his mother sold my house behind my back. But I wasn't going to play by their rules. I decided to stay, catch them in the act, and see how they'd wriggle out. And then whatever happens. Andrew got up closer to noon, stretching and yawning as if it were an ordinary weekend. "Natalie," he said, coming into the kitchen where I was peeling potatoes, "let's go to town today, to that cafe where you like the pastries. Let's walk around, get some fresh air." His voice was so warm, so sincere, that for a second I doubted. Maybe I made everything up? Maybe he really just wants to spend time with me. But then I remembered his words behind the fence. I don't know how to do that. No, this wasn't about us. This was about their conspiracy. I smiled to not give myself away and said, "Sure, good idea. But I'll go to the store first. We're out of bread." He nodded, suspecting nothing, and went to the bathroom. I left the house, but not to the store, to Aunt Clara. I needed someone to know what was happening, just in case things went wrong. Aunt Clara was in the yard trimming bushes, and, seeing me, immediately put down the shears. "Natalie, what's wrong? You look like a shadow. Trouble again." I told her everything, about the overheard conversation, about their plan to bring a realtor, about how Andrew was pretending everything was normal. She listened, frowned, and said, "Dear, you're doing right not staying silent. But be careful. People like your mother-in-law are slippery as snakes. And your husband, he may not be mean, but he's weak as a rag. If anything, call me, I'll come with a pitchfork." I smiled, though my soul was heavy. "Thanks, Aunt Clara. I'll manage. But if anything, I know where to find you." When I got back home, I pretended I was getting ready to go to town. I put on jeans, a sweater, even hung a purse over my shoulder. Andrew was already waiting by the car, impatiently tapping his key against his palm. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, but at the last moment said, "Oh, I forgot my phone. Just a minute." I went into the house, but instead of getting my phone, I hid in the storage room, where I could see the yard through a crack in the door. I knew it was silly, that I was acting like in a cheap detective story, but I needed to see everything with my own eyes. After a few minutes, I heard a car pull up. Not ours, another one with a low engine rumble. I looked through the crack and saw Linda entering the yard in her usual coat and with that same smile that made my teeth ache. Next to her was a man, the one in a suit with a folder I'd seen before. And behind them walked Andrew, my Andrew, who just minutes ago was trying to convince me to go to a cafe to relax. I felt blood rush to my head, but I forced myself to breathe. Not yet. I had to wait. They walked around the yard, and I heard fragments of conversation. Linda was saying something about good property, convenient location, could build another house. The man nodded, wrote things down, and Andrew was silent, but I could see him nervously fidgeting with his sleeve. They approached the house, and Linda said, "Here, of course, it needs repairs, but those are minor details. The main thing is the land." I couldn't take it. I came out of the storage room, threw open the door, and stepped into the yard. They turned around, and their faces showed such surprise I almost laughed. Andrew went pale. Linda opened her mouth, and the man in the suit just froze, holding his pen over the folder. "What's going on here?" I asked, and my voice was firmer than I expected. Linda recovered first. "Natalie, dear, but you're supposed to be in town," she began. But I cut her off. "I'm home, in my house, and I see you selling my property here." Andrew stepped toward me, raising his hands as if to calm me. "Natalie, you don't understand. This is just an appraisal. Nobody's selling anything." I looked at him, and at that moment everything I felt for him, love, hope, pain, compressed into one ball of fury. "Don't lie to me," I said. "I heard everything. You conspired with her. You deceived me." Linda stepped forward, still with that smile. "Natalie, why are you so upset? We're trying to help you. The house is big, you two don't need so much, and the money could go to something useful." I turned to her, and something inside me snapped. "Useful for you, right? This is my house, Linda. Mine. I won't let you touch it." She snorted. "Oh, Natalie, don't yell. You're not the only one deciding here. Andrew has rights too." That was the last straw. I stepped toward her and, without thinking, slapped her. Not hard, but loud enough. She gasped, grabbed her cheek, and the man in the suit backed away, muttering something about, "I'll call you back." "If I see you here one more time, I'll rip your hair out," I said, and there was such anger in my voice that even I was surprised. Linda looked at me like an enemy and hissed, "You'll regret this yet." I turned to Andrew, "And if you go along with her one more time, you'll fly out of my house to your mommy and divorce." He stood as if stunned and just nodded. Linda grabbed his hand and dragged him to the car, throwing out finally, "We'll talk about this." The man in the suit had already disappeared, and I was left in the yard alone, with my heart pounding wildly. When they left, I went into the house and sat on the couch. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't crying. I felt like I'd just fought and won. But this victory was bitter. I knew Andrew wouldn't change, knew his promise was empty words, and knew our marriage, which I'd tried so hard to save, was already dead. I sat in the silence, looking at Mom's curtains, and thought about what was next. Divorce. Loneliness. I didn't know, but I knew the house was mine, and I wouldn't give it to anyone. After that scene in the yard, the house seemed even quieter, as if the walls had absorbed my anger and now kept it as a secret. I sat in the kitchen, looking at Mom's curtains that swayed slightly in the draft, trying to understand what I felt. Anger, yes, but not as hot as an hour ago. Hurt? Of course, it sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow or spit out. And there was emptiness, cold, sticky, like fog creeping into a house through cracks. I had won the battle for my house, but lost something bigger. And that something was my marriage, my Andrew, my dreams of a family where we'd be together despite everything. Andrew came back late that evening, when the sky had already turned black and stars hid behind clouds. I heard the gate creak, heard his steps shuffle across the porch. He came in without looking at me, threw his jacket on the chair, and said, "Natalie, I understand everything. I was wrong. Let's talk." His voice was quiet, almost pleading, but I didn't feel the warmth in it that I once loved. I looked at him, at his tired eyes, rumpled shirt, hands nervously fiddling with his belt, and realized I didn't believe him. Not a single word. "Talk," I said, crossing my arms. He sat across from me, sighed, and began. "Mom went too far. I didn't want it to turn out this way. She thinks we need money, that it's better for everyone. But I told her I won't participate in this anymore. I'm sorry, Natalie. I didn't want to deceive you." I listened, and each word was like a prick. Not because he was lying, maybe he really believed he was repentant, but because I knew this wasn't the end. He could promise, swear, even cry, but as soon as Linda snapped her fingers, he'd run to her again like a puppy. "You told her you won't participate," I repeated slowly. "But why did you participate at all? Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? Why did I have to eavesdrop, hide, to find out that my husband and his mother are selling my house?" Andrew opened his mouth, but said nothing. He just looked at me, and in his gaze was a mixture of shame and resentment. "I thought you'd understand," he finally squeezed out. "Mom's alone, it's hard for her, and we have everything. I wanted to help." I shook my head. "Help by deceiving me. That's not help, Andrew. That's betrayal." He stood up, paced around the kitchen as if looking for something to hold on to. "Natalie, what do you want? For me to cut ties with my mom? She's my mother. I can't abandon her." And that's when I understood everything was over. Not because I stopped loving him, but because he would never choose me. Never. "I'm not asking you to abandon your mother," I said, and my voice was calmer than I expected. "I'm asking you to be my husband. But you can't, and I can't live anymore with someone who doesn't respect me." He froze, as if not expecting these words. "What are you talking about?" he asked, anxiety creeping into his voice. "You want a divorce?" I looked him in the eyes and nodded. "Yes, Andrew, I do." He opened his mouth to say something, but I raised my hand. "Don't. I've made up my mind. This house is mine, and I'm staying in it. And you can go to your mom. She's more important to you." He left that same night. Without slamming the door, without shouting, he just packed a bag, silently put on his shoes, and left. I stood at the window, watching his car drive out of the yard, and I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because the tears had run out. The divorce went quickly. We had nothing to divide. The house was mine, the car was his, and everything else we'd acquired turned out to be so minor it wasn't worth arguing over. A month later, I received papers stating in black and white that I was alone again. And that word alone didn't sound like a sentence, but like relief, albeit bitter. 3 months passed. I slowly started putting the house in order, painted the fence, bought new curtains, signed up for sewing classes to distract myself. Life didn't become easier, but it became clearer. I knew what I wanted, to keep my house, my memories, myself. But the emptiness didn't go anywhere. It sat next to me when I drank tea, when I weeded the garden, when I went to bed in a cold bed. And I accepted that it would always be this way. One evening, when I was sitting with a book, someone knocked on the door. I opened it and saw Andrew. He looked worse than before. Stubble, bags under his eyes, wrinkled jacket, as if he'd been sleeping in it. "Natalie," he said, shifting from foot to foot. "Can we talk?" I let him in, though my heart clenched with anxiety. He sat on the couch, rubbed his hands, and began, "I was wrong. I understand everything now. Mom, she wasn't right. We fought. I left her place. I miss you, Natalie. Let's try again." His voice trembled, and I almost believed him. Almost. But then I noticed how he was surveying the room, how his gaze caught on familiar things, on the comfort I'd preserved. And I understood he didn't miss me. He came because he had nowhere to go. "Why did you fight?" I asked, looking into his eyes. He hesitated, mumbled something about household trifles, but I didn't let him dodge the question. "Andrew, tell the truth. Are you here because your mom kicked you out?" He looked away, and that was enough. I stood up, opened the door, and said, "Leave. I'm not a shelter and not a second mother." He looked at me as if he wanted to object, but then just nodded and left. The door closed, and I was alone in my house with the silence that was now not an enemy, but a friend. I walked to the window, looked at the maple that had already shed its leaves, and thought I had done the right thing. But that didn't mean it was easy. I chose myself, my house, my life, but paid a price I'd feel for a long time. And yet, standing at that window, I understood that this pain wasn't the end but the beginning. The beginning of a life where I'm my own master, where no one dares decide for me, where my house isn't just walls, but my fortress, my memory, my truth. And here's what I want to say to those reading this story. Life is like this house. You build it with your own hands, put your heart into it, protect it as best you can. But sometimes people come, close ones, loved ones, those you trust, and try to take what's yours. Not always out of malice. Sometimes they just don't see how their desires hurt you. And here's what's important. Don't be silent, don't endure, don't hope it'll all work out on its own. You have to stand up and say, this is mine and I won't give it up. Even if it means fighting, losing someone, being alone. Because if you give up what's dear to you, you give up yourself. And you can't lose yourself. That's the only thing we truly have. I don't know what comes next. Maybe I'll stay in this house alone, with Mom's curtains and creaky floorboards. Maybe I'll find a new path, new people, a new version of myself. But I know this house is mine, this life is mine. And no one, not Andrew, not Linda, not their victors with folders, will take away what I fought for. And you reading this, think about what you have that you're ready to defend. And do you have the strength to say no, even when it hurts? Because sometimes no is the only thing that saves you. That's the story. Like and subscribe to the channel.